Hello and welcome to CineMaine, where we take a look at films that are connected to Maine, whether they be set in Maine, filmed in Maine, or have any other loose connections to the state of Maine. And today we are looking at the 1989 horror film Pet Sematary. Based off of the novel by Stephen King, who also wrote the film's screenplay and even cameos in the film at one point. King's connection to Maine is pretty much common knowledge to anyone who has ever read at least one of his books or seen at least one of his works adapted into a film or miniseries. And trust me, there's definitely a lot of them. I chose to talk about Pet Sematary for my first Stephen King-based CineMaine episode for a specific reason. I recently attended a Q&A for this film in honor of its 35th anniversary that featured cast members such as Denise Crosby, Dale Midkiff, Brad Greenquist, and Andrew Hubitzek. During this Q&A, the cast noted that when the original novel was republished many years after this film came out, King added a foreword before the novel stating that he personally felt this was the scariest thing he had ever written. Considering that he's widely known for his contributions to the horror genre, I figured that reason alone would make this film a good place to start. So some connections to Maine are pretty obvious from the get-go, what with the film being based off of a novel from an author from Maine. But the connections to Maine don't stop there. The central characters in this film, the Creed family, move from Chicago to Ludlow, Maine. While Ludlow is a real town in Maine that's located in Aroostook County, the version of Ludlow that's portrayed in Pet Sematary is a fictionalized version that's based more closely off of Orrington. This version of Ludlow is located near the fictional town of Derry, which is based off of Bangor, but that's another story. On top of being set in Maine, the movie was also 99% filmed in Maine, something that King lobbied really hard for when selling the film rights to this story. In fact, King himself was very prominent in the film's production, not only writing the film's script, but he also personally chose the film's director, Mary Lambert, to helm this project, and was even present for the first 2 weeks of production on top of cameoing as a Googleizer during a funeral scene. His cameo was filmed at the Mount Hope Cemetery in Bangor. I've actually been told by a lot of people that they remember observing filming of this scene from a distance while driving near the Penobscot River. And as someone who's been to this exact cemetery quite a few times, I can definitely tell that they filmed this there just by watching this scene. The same location is used again later on in the film when Lewis tries to dig up the grave of his recently deceased son Gage, so he can rebury him at the pet cemetery that his neighbor Judd Crandall had been talking to him about earlier in the film. Speaking of which, the location of the pet cemetery that his son is reburied at, along with his cat Winston Churchill earlier on, was filmed in Sedgwick, with footage of Lewis and Judd's walk to said pet cemetery being filmed at an abandoned quarry located on Mount Desert Island. The Creed's residence was filmed in Hancock, and the scene where the Creed family tries to fly their kite higher before Gage is unfortunately run over by a truck was filmed in Bucksport. There is a part of me that has suspicions that the airport scenes were filmed at Bangor International Airport, like a certain other Stephen King adaptation was, since the interior looks fairly similar to me, but I can neither confirm nor deny this, as A, I wasn't around yet when this movie came out, let alone when it was filmed, and B, I couldn't find any mentions of Bangor International Airport during my research. One thing I do know is that at the Q&A I attended, it was mentioned that the only scene to not be filmed in Maine was the film's final scene, where Rachel is brought back after being buried at the pet cemetery almost immediately after being murdered. The original ending was filmed in Maine, which showed only an undead Rachel entering the kitchen that Lewis is in, leaving his fate more open-ended. Paramount didn't like this ending because they found it wasn't gory enough, so the scene was reshot on sound stages in Hollywood, with a lot more gory makeup and practical effects added to up the gore factor, with Lewis's fate being made abundantly clearer than it was originally meant to. There are also little touches here and there, like the scene that happens early on where Judd Crandall invites Lewis to sit on his front porch and have a beer with him. That is something that Mainers typically do, and Gwyn even pronounced beer right.
Well, come on up and have a beer.
Another detail I definitely found striking was this one mustard jar that Judd is using while having dinner in one scene. This jar reminds me of Ray's Mustard, which is a locally made brand. As someone who uses Ray's Mustard in a lot of meals myself, this is definitely a detail I got a kick out of, to say the least. There's also the one scene where we do get to see where Louis Creed works as a doctor working at the University of Maine's hospital. As someone who's graduated from UMaine, I can attest that the location they shot at certainly looks like it could be UMaine. But it was actually the Ellsworth Town Hall, so this movie has quite the plethora of connections to the state of Maine. As far as my overall thoughts on this movie go, it's complicated. This is one of those movies where a lot of people I've talked to about it, usually horror and Stephen King fans in general, really love this movie. On the other hand, a lot of other people I've talked to about this movie seem to hate it, with some even claiming it's personally their least favorite film they've ever seen due to the extremities of the film's subject matter. This is definitely one of those movies where I equally understand both the fans and the haters alike. That said, there's definitely a lot to admire about this film, and there are multiple aspects of it that I do admire. As I mentioned earlier, this film's very unique in that it's one of the very few horror films to actually be directed by a woman. And considering the time period this film came out in, that just makes it all the more impressive to me. Denise Crosby mentioned that while the significance of this is far more apparent to her now, she didn't really notice the significance of it back then due to having previously worked with this film's director, Mary Lambert, who beforehand had worked on plenty of Madonna's music videos and was supposed to direct a starring vehicle for Prince before he booted her off due to wanting to direct that film himself after all. I also think it's really cool that she was actually King's choice to direct and not the studio, and how, from what I can tell, she was for the most part given a lot of creative freedom on this project, particularly when it came to the casting. One of the most iconic Stephen King characters ever, Judd Crandall, was played by Fred Gwynne, who Mary had personally chosen to play the character. The studio was reluctant about this due to Gwynne being mostly known for his role as Herman Munster for so long, but still gave the casting choice a shot, and as a result, we got a pretty iconic performance out of him, which has led to this character being referenced throughout pop culture for many years after this film came out. The cast have also spoken favorably about their experiences working with him, with Denise Crosby noting that, and I am paraphrasing a bit here, he was a big child at heart. With a lot of actors, the further down they are in their career, they tend to become a bit more jaded and more unavailable. Gwynne was anything but. You can definitely tell when watching this film that he must have been a joy to work with. He gives the Judd Crandall character a sense of warmth and amiability that makes him enjoyable to watch. On top of that, his main accent in this film is the only main accent that actually doesn't sound too over the top. Yeah, speaking as a Mainer, I gotta be honest, I've never heard anyone use a legit Maine accent in real life, let alone ones that are anywhere near as thick as the accents that the characters in this film have. The actors playing the Creed family don't use accents because their characters are meant to be from Chicago, but some of the Maine natives have accents that are way too over the top and romanticized. Gwynne, on the other hand, comes the closest to having an actual believable accent. Another actor who was personally handpicked by the director was Miko Hughes, who plays Gage Creed in this film. Initially, the studio wanted to get a pair of twins to play the role of Gage because, well, that's what usually happens for characters that are this young. Upon meeting Miko, however, Mary Lambert said, "That's Gage, and I'm willing to accommodate the schedule just for him." I imagine this must have caused the production phase of this film to go on a little longer than usual since Miko could only work for a couple hours at a time. Especially since this film was apparently shot in order, which is something that really doesn't happen very often. Usually whenever a film crew is at a location that appears multiple times throughout a film, they try to get all of the scenes that take place at that location while they have access to it. This usually leads to movies not being filmed in chronological order. A big reason why this film was shot in sequence, however, was, on top of making it easier to keep track of continuity, it also meant that they could ease Miko into trusting the whole filmmaking process. Mary felt it would be easier to do that by filming the scenes with the Creeds as a happy family first, and therefore it would be easier to acclimate Miko into some of the later scenes. Thus, she mapped out the entire shooting schedule in advance with all of this in mind. This aspect in particular was something that definitely felt more striking to me when I rewatched this film post Q&A. While I can't act like this film doesn't have certain flaws here and there, I will say that continuity is one of this film's biggest strengths. And I think it was a smart call on Mary Lambert's part to film everything in chronological order. This was a risk that definitely paid off. Another risk she took was casting a grown man to play Rachel Creed's teenage older sister Zelda during flashback sequences. There's a scene during the first half of the movie where Lewis's wife Rachel is confiding in him about a traumatic event from her childhood involving her older sister Zelda, who had been suffering from spinal meningitis so badly that it caused her to be deformed, bedridden, and essentially in an altered state of consciousness. You would think this character would be played by a teenage girl, but Andrew Hubitzek was cast instead, as Mary felt that this character would be far more frightening if she were played by a grown man. I have to admit, I had no idea that Zelda was played by a man until this Q&A, so major kudos to the makeup department on this film for transforming Andrew's appearance. Speaking of which, the makeup and practical effects still look incredible even 35 years later. Whenever someone is brought back from the dead or appears as a ghost, they do a really good job of making them look creepy and decrepit. I particularly love the makeup effects on Brad Greenquist, who plays a ghost that Lewis tries to save named Victor Pascow. You really buy that this guy died in a rather gruesome manner. Speaking of Victor Pascow, this was a character that I definitely paid more attention to rewatching this film post Q&A, and I definitely think he's one of the film's strongest aspects. Greenquist mentioned that he decided not to play this role up as incredibly scary because he felt the film wouldn't have worked as much if he hadn't played the role so straight. This was a very smart call on his part, as I found Victor's character was easily the most believable in the entire film. When Lewis tries to save him on the operating table, it's pretty clear that it's too late for that, but Victor's ghost appears thanking him for trying to save him anyway, and tells him that he'll try to help him and his family in return. And throughout the course of the movie, that's exactly what he tries to do, speaking not only to Lewis, but also his daughter Ellie, as well as his wife Rachel later on, in a scene where she hitches a ride back to her home on an Orinco truck. A little odd that this is the same brand of truck that ran her son over earlier, but when she decides to get off, both the driver and Victor thank her, and the exchange that she has is very clever. The driver obviously believes that she's thanking him for giving her a ride back to where she needs to go, but the way she phrases what she says makes it seem like she's talking to both Victor and the driver at the same time. That's very clever. Something else I noticed about this scene upon rewatching this film is that the numbers on the side of this truck say 666. This was definitely something I didn't notice on first viewing, and considering this truck is the same brand as the one that ran Gage over, I actually went back to check and see if that truck had the same numbers on it. Turns out it's 668. I guess the filmmakers just repainted the 8 to look like a 6 instead, but still. I love when movies have little details like that without throwing them right in your face, but instead just subtly present them for the viewer to discover on subsequent rewatches. I also really like the music in this film. While the score may sound a little too similar to the music from Amityville Horror at times, it's still atmospheric enough that it does add to what the film is trying to do. And of course, as a fan of punk rock myself, I love that the Ramones were involved in this film. Their song Sheena is a Punk Rocker is being listened to by one of the truck drivers during one scene, but the Ramones also wrote a new song to play during the credits that's actually inspired by the story. I've heard that the Ramones are King's favorite band, so I think it's really cool that he was able to get them to write an original song for something he was heavily involved in. It would be like if I made a movie and was able to get Green Day to write music for it. So on top of liking all of that, as well as some really good cinematography that really captures what Maine is like during autumn, you must be thinking to yourself, man, this guy must really love this movie. But in all honesty, there are aspects of it that do make me understand why some people might find this film off-putting. While I still think it's incredibly cool that King wrote the movie's script, it's not one of his stronger works, sadly, and there are aspects of it that I found to be either forced or a bit hard to believe. Everything about the Judd Crandall character I do like is honestly 100% because of Fred Gwynn's performance. On paper, though, this character kinda inadvertently instigates most of what happens. The Creed's daughter, Ellie, learns about what death is after Judd Crandall talks to the Creeds about the Pet Sematary and this road that trucks always drive fast on. This is the first time in her life she's ever learned about the concept of death. So naturally, she starts to worry about their cat getting run over, which, sure enough, ends up happening during the first act. Even though Judd made it pretty clear that burying pets at this place is a bad idea, he still decides for Lewis that they're gonna bury the cat there anyway. Weren't you just saying this was a bad idea earlier? He does later explain that he chose to do this because he thinks Ellie is too young to live through something like that, but that's honestly not his call to make. That's something that Lewis and Rachel should decide because, you know, they're her parents. He's not. And of course, later on in the movie, Gage gets run over by a truck and it's incredibly tragic. Judd later tells Lewis that it's a terrible idea to bury his son there. Thing is, that thought hadn't even crossed Lewis's mind at all. He was too overcome with grief and devastation to even get the idea on his own. It wasn't until Judd planted the idea in his mind that he decided to give it a try, despite warnings from both Judd and Victor not to do this. But why does he keep trying things like this out anyway? Because we would have had a really short movie otherwise. Speaking of which, the father makes some stupid choices in this film. On top of burying Church and Gage at the Pet Sematary to bring them both back, he also decides to bury Rachel there almost instantly after she's killed. By her newly resurrected son, no less. I do like that he at least explains his logic every time as a way of helping the viewer make sense of why he's doing something so senseless. But it still feels like he never truly learns from any of his mistakes. This guy goes through some of the worst things any parent could ever potentially go through, and you would think he'd realize that some of these choices could result in later reliving certain things. Yet he never learns, and he ends up paying the ultimate price for it every time. As for the Pet Sematary itself, it's kinda cliche to use the whole Indian burial ground trope, but I will give some credit that King did at least get the detail of the Micmac's location right, as they are one of many tribes that is located in Maine among other places. That being said, I'm not going to act like I'm an expert on Micmac burial practices, but something tells me that this film may not be the most culturally accurate when talking about said burial practices. Awkward. Things like that, as well as the fact that this film has subject matter such as mortality in children and animals, and even matricide among other things, do make it easy for me to see why this film may be off-putting to many people. Admittedly, I didn't like this film either the first time I sat through it, even though I wanted to like it. However, subsequent rewatches have caused me to notice a few more things each time that have made me glad that I gave the film another chance, so I guess you could say that this film has kinda grown on me over time. And in a lot of ways, this movie was kind of ahead of its time. The horror genre was a lot more niche back in the late 80s, as at the time your average horror movie put out by a major studio was usually a slasher movie. Whereas this film is more like a supernatural tragedy, which is something that is definitely done more often nowadays along with other different types of horror films, and I think it's really cool that this film kinda helped pave the way for all of that. Overall, I do highly recommend this film to those who are massive horror fans and Stephen King fans alike. Though I will say, if you are a parent of a young child or have recently lost a beloved pet, it might not be a bad idea to wait a while before checking this one out, because some aspects of this film may go a little too far for your taste. Even King has said he felt like he went too far in a few places with this. Otherwise, it's a flawed yet fascinating tale, one that is uniquely King. If you liked this video, be sure to check out CineMaine's website and be on the lookout for future CineMaine content.